Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to be playing with leaf leather. I have spent months, if not years, trying to get my hands on this, and it has proven incredibly difficult. But I finally found a supplier with a really good range of colors, so it's time for some fun. And that's really what this is going to be. This is an experimentation. This is not going to produce a really sturdy, long-lasting pair of practical shoes. This is going to be a novelty. So I figured, what better way to make use of leaf leather than to make leaf shoes? And though I've not really had an excuse to make them up until this point, I do have a photo shoot coming up that is elven themed, so I'm going to actually be able to wear leaf shoes made out of leaf leather in the forest surrounded by leaves. So I'm very curious to see how that goes in the end, but for today I just really want to go through the experimentation of using this material because I've been very curious about how it behaves. Though we call it leather, it really isn't, and it isn't a direct substitute for leather either. In order to make it strong enough to be usable, it's added to a backing of a textile. The leaf itself has been preserved and dyed in 2 different colors. Then it is adhered to the cotton backing and another protective layer is put on top of that, which means that it's not terribly flexible. Though the backing of the fabric is there to help strengthen it, it won't deal with abrasion well, it roughs up really easily and it's not repairable, and it just doesn't curve and stretch. So I have to be really particular with how I design these shoes. That means I can't do a regular shoe for this. I need to be a little creative. I need to try and use the leaf to its best abilities, make sure that I'm keeping the really natural beauty of it while not asking it to do too much. For this reason, I chose to go with a flat style rather than something with a heel that usually requires more curves to get over it. I'm also going with a square toe, which should allow me to fold over the edges rather than having to curve around a rounded toe or deal with the really narrow point of the pointed styles. I know even in good leather those can sometimes be difficult, so a square toe seemed like it was going to be the easiest and most practical for this particular material. But I will probably still find some problems along the way with working with it, because it is very much a novelty thing. Though these are often advertised as vegan leather, which sort of implies that they are a replacement for animal-based leathers, things like this just really aren't, at least yet. There are a lot of novel things out there: mushroom leather, apple leather, cactus leather, all sorts of interesting things, but they do far better at replacing leather in places where it is straight and stable. So things like wallets or purses even do very well with that. But when it comes to shoes, it is incredibly complicated because they're constantly moving, flexing. You have to shape it over curves. Even if you're making a pair of shoes by hand, it's going to go through a lot of stress just to get it into shoe form, let alone be worn as a shoe. And that's why nearly all of the shoes that you find, if they aren't in leather, are in some version of plastic or plastic mixed in, just in order to get that strength and that stretch. And that is one of the reasons in general that I use regular leather for my shoes. I do try to go with vegetable tanned rather than chrome tanned, just because it is a little bit easier to work with and it is better for the environment and it is longer lasting and a little bit easier to maintain, in my opinion. But I want really long lasting pair of shoes and not a plastic pair of shoes. But this gives me a great opportunity to experiment with something on the market that isn't really going to work long-term for shoes yet, but in the future there might be more and more options that we come up with that can mimic the stretchiness and the reboundability, the strength and the durability and the repairability of leather. So we're going to have fun today seeing how this turns out and making a really novel and interesting pair of shoes in the process. It just first comes down to making sure that I come up with a design that's going to work for this. So these leaves are fairly large, which means that I should be able to get one shoe out of one leaf if I use it right. Playing around with the different layouts that I could do, I figured out that doing something wrapped in front made more sense. This means that with that overlap, I can get around the complex curves of the foot a little bit easier. And the back, well, ideally I would have a center back seam in order to get over the curve of the heel to hold everything in place. That's a really important thing to make it a comfortable shoe, but that is just not easy. I'm trying to avoid seaming and stitching this because I honestly don't think it's going to hold stitches terribly well in the long term. So instead, I'm just going to wrap the larger point of the leaf around the back and figure on lacing around the ankle or over the front of the foot in order to hold it into place and keep my foot stable. So that means I'll have 3 different pieces that use up the majority of the leaf. I will be lining the whole thing in leather, however, just because it will add strength and the lining will be able to hold my foot in more tightly without stressing the leaves. I'm trying to keep it all within the same tone range. I'm not doing a ton of finishing and extra effort. It's going to look a little rough and natural, but on purpose. So the first thing I'm going to do once I've figured out a rough idea of how I'm going to lay this thing out is to make up a very basic pattern. Normally I do a really complex one where I masking tape over the entire last, draw everything out, and work out a very complex shape, do test versions. But for this one, the masking tape and some general lines should be enough to get me going, and I'm going to try and keep the natural shape and the natural beauty of this leaf, which means that this won't be exactly the same for every piece, but it needs to be large enough to have the seam allowance to make it over the toe. Same thing in the back. I don't know just how high I want this yet, so I'm giving myself a little bit of extra. Do also appreciate that the fronts look a little bit like lungs in that situation. But I'm also realizing at this point that the cotton's a little bit loose along the edges, so I might have to do something with that since it's bright white. I'm then going ahead and overlapping the two fronts. I chose to do this overlapping style because it's way easier to get an interesting design out of those veins, but that does mean that I want to adhere them together, even if it is somewhat temporary, in order to work with them as an entire front shape. I'm leaving the rest of it separate simply because it's going to be a lot easier for me to flat last that way, and the two layers will be stronger. The lining, however, is getting cut out as one, so you can see the triangular back shape as well as a more heart front shape. I am using the natural curves here, cutting the linings just a little bit bigger because I'll trim them down once everything is glued together. I'm starting off in the back with just the center back being glued together. So only at the top. I'm leaving the bottom free because I'll be putting a little heel cup in there to help hold things to my foot a little bit better since I won't have a curvy back seam. But this will be the start of putting these two pieces together. I'm not gluing them together completely. I'm just doing the center back and along the edges. Because the back is going to curve, the lining is usually cut slightly smaller. So instead of doing that to begin with, I'm making sure that I'm curving it as I'm laying them together, and then I'll go back and trim later. Same thing with the front section, the vamp here. This is going to be laid out flat and just glued along those top edges. I'm not gluing around the toes, around the bottom, so I don't have to deal with the curve nearly as much here. But this allows me to cut the leather lining back really close to the edge to make sure that it holds true to the weird shapes that the leaves naturally have. I am noticing at this point that white line is going to be really obvious, so I'm going back in and dyeing it slightly just so it blends in a little bit better with the orangey tone of the natural leaf and the lining. Also making sure to do it where they cross over on the top because that will also be very visible on the final shoe. Once the uppers are pretty well assembled, I'm not doing any stitching on those. I'm moving on to the rest of the ingredients. Starting with that little heel cup, I'm going to need that reinforcement there to make sure that this stays on my foot. So I'm using a light but very stiff leather for this portion, and I'm pre-shaping it onto the last so that way I don't have to have it soaking wet in order to actually assemble everything. Right now it is soaking wet because once it dries it turns super stiff. This needs to be stretched and pulled and shaped, trimmed down, the edges feathered, so that way it's as invisible as possible in the final product. Then the next ingredients are the insoles. I took a pattern off of the bottom of the last and came up with a rough insole and then trimmed it down, nailed onto the last to get it perfect. I was able to transfer that to the second insole so they're exactly the same because, like I said, there are no rights or lefts in this, just straight last. And then I'm able to go through and very carefully cut that shape out. This takes quite a few passes because it is a pretty heavy leather, compacted and condensed. Then to make sure that it's not going to be bulky, I'm going and feathering down the edges to nothing. The sole will have a similar treatment done to it. I've cut it slightly larger than the insole to get the final shape that I need, and I'm carefully going around, cutting back all those edges, and then feathering it down. I'm not feathering quite as far. There's still a little bit of thickness along the sides, especially in the back heel area, but it does help to allow me to get it curved up and around the last. I did find pretty quickly that it's still too thick of a sole leather. Getting really thin sole leather is difficult to do. This is as thin as it usually comes, and it's too thick for most of the things that I do. So I actually skive it down. This is one of the ways to do that. It's the way that I was taught. And once I've worked the thickness down as far as I need to, I'll go back in with a rasp and file it all down so it's rough. So that way when I go to apply the glue later, it actually sticks to it. The final part that I want to prepare is the cork. This will sit in between the sole and the rest of the shoe in order to fill out some of the gaps that we'll see later. I just need this to be started a little bit smaller than the sole, so it doesn't need to be perfect just yet. Then I'm able to start lasting. Historical lasts like this will use an instep leather that sits on top that allows me to get it to the right size and proportions for my foot. So I could use the same last for a lot of different people's feet. The insole is then tacked down to start with. I'm working right side out with this pair of shoes. We're not going to do a turn shoe pair. So insole goes in first. That is tacked in 3 locations to hold it down well. It's going to kind of stick up from the edges for right now. I've had it soaking in water overnight though, so it is pretty malleable. It will eventually curve itself down and dry into the right position. I'm decided to go ahead and start with the vamp first because I know where this needs to be placed. Too high up on the foot, I won't be able to get my foot in, too low, and it's not going to hold my foot well. So I've figured out where it needs to sit on my foot, and I can get that temporarily tacked into place to make sure that it is lined up correctly. It's not skewed one side or the other, it's looking symmetrical, and putting another tack at the very center of the toe in order to hold it temporarily. I want to emphasize temporarily because I'm going to have to work each layer individually. I can't just treat it as one big upper because they are still separate layers, and that's really the better way to do this. The lining is going to have a lot more stretch to it. That's great. That means that it's going to hold really tightly to my foot. It's a really strong leather. I've worked with this for a lot of linings before. I know I can get it curved over the toe really well, but I want to make sure that I'm not putting in wrinkles or bumps that I can't see until the outer layers start to show the ghost of it. So this is something that I'm doing independently and taking my time on. I'm using my lasting pliers to pull down and away from the toe in order to pull the fullness to a place where I can actually hide those wrinkles a little bit better, because there's no way that I can get fully around the entirety of this complex shape without some wrinkles. But the important thing is those wrinkles shouldn't go over the edge. The feather edge, as we call it, where the last suddenly goes from being the bottom of the shoe to the side of the shoe, is a really important point. And these wrinkles need to stay under the foot, because there I can hide them. There it is seam allowance, and I can cut into them if I need to. I can rasp them down, I can stretch it and work it into place. So those wrinkles being underneath the foot is where I want them. I just don't want them up and over the edge. And that's what's really important, and also what's going to be really difficult with the leaf leather because it doesn't really stretch. The lining, however, really easy to work with. The toe, super smooth, really nicely done. I love the shape of the square-toed last, and I am really happy with how that turned out. So I'm going to leave that to dry for a little bit while I start working on the back of the shoe. This is a little bit more complicated because unlike the front where I can pull and tug, if I pull and tug it's just loose. So I'm starting off by centering up that back vein because it is so very obvious if it's not on center, and then I'm making sure that it's wrapped as tightly as I can with the leaf around the back. The tighter it is, the closer it's going to hold to my foot and the more stable the shoe is going to feel. But again, it just really doesn't have any stretch, so the fact that I don't have a bunch of seams to shape it mean it's going to be a little difficult to work with. I am putting the back under the vamp, so I'm popping those tacks out of the way temporarily so that way I can layer this in that manner. I just visually prefer it for this particular shoe. There's not a rule about this. And then I'm able to pop out that temporary center back tack and start working down the lining leather. Again, making sure that this is as smooth as possible, but I can't pull on it with the lasting pliers because it will just yank the whole thing loose. So I'm trying to hold it down with one hand and put the tacks in with the other to make sure that it's all stable. Once I have that in place, I'm removing the tacks at the side so that way everything is loose enough that I can get into the lining as well, and I'll be able to put that heel cup in later. Then comes the very slow process of actually gluing down each section. So I'm working with a type of cement that's meant for shoemaking that requires you to paint both sides separately wait for it to dry. So here in the desert, that takes 5 or 10 minutes, depending on if I'm working on wet leather or dry leather. And then I can adhere the 2 layers together and they will solidify really well. It'll still take a few more hours after that to properly cure, but it will hold pretty well. So I'm able to go around bit by bit, removing a couple of tacks at a time, painting that one section, and then adhering it down and making sure everything's smooth. Once that's happened, I can remove some of the extra, so that way I don't have as many lumps and bumps under the foot. I'm trying to smooth this out. I'm actually going in with a knife and carving down some of those wrinkles as well. Essentially, it's kind of like putting little relief cuts in your sewing, roughing it up again to make sure that the cement that I'm using really adheres well. Smooth surfaces don't like to adhere to each other. We're just not going to have a good time with that. Then that heel cap can go in very carefully. I've painted a good amount of the cement around the interior edges, so it's really well adhered to that lining all the way up and around. And I'm going to take the time to work down those edges and feather them as well. So again, everything is as smooth as possible. Then back to the toe with the lining, making sure that each one of those wrinkles is done very evenly, because I had to take all those tacks out and then cement it down. I want to make sure that it turns out just as even as when I tacked it in place. Using the backside of the hammer to try and get into that small space, and I'll be trimming that area down as well. Back around to the back, because that needs to be done before I can finish adhering the lining of the front, I'm making sure that the very last corners are pulled not too tight, simply because the leaf is not going to pull tightly around the back either, and then working the leaf seam allowance down very carefully. Again, making sure that those wrinkles don't go over the edge. It's going to wrinkle no matter what I do. I'm not able to actually pull this taut. Wetting it down, I found, made it more weak rather than stretchier. So some areas of this leather are going to be a little bit damp, but I try to avoid that wherever possible. And instead, I'm just making little tiny relief cuts. I did find that I can't use a knife on this stuff because of the fabric underneath. It just chewed up really quickly when I tried that, so I had to go in with a pair of scissors to do all the trimming. I am also going in and roughing it up because it is so smooth. It's not going to adhere to the next layers. In doing this though, a lot of the top leaf layers come off and reveal just the fabric underneath, which is okay. That area is going to adhere just fine, but it's definitely a good sign that this will be really easily damaged in the future, especially if it's wet. Once the back is finally down, I can overlap it with the front lining and get back to dealing with all of that. So I'm still tapering down those edges, making sure that it's as flat as possible. We're trying to get rid of the lumps and bumps as much as we can. And the same thing is going to go for the toe portion of the leaves. I did keep this in 2 sections because I didn't think one layer with a partially visible section was going to be strong enough. I wanted each section to be able to hold its own. So I'm putting the toe over first and then working the sides back. And I'll be cutting into these in order to get rid of the extra rather than folding it over and creating bulk. This is going to be the opposite of the way that I'll be doing the external leaf. So I'm hoping that this will reduce the amount of bulk in that area. I'll be able to trim things down really well and hopefully get as clean and crisp of a fold as possible, because I certainly can't curve over the corners. It's going to have to be folded. Here I'm putting 2 relief cuts in order to make it as flat as possible. The corners aren't perfectly right angled, they're actually a little bit curved, so putting 2 relief cuts in order to make it over that really helped. And then I'm trimming back as much of the allowance as I possibly can to try and get this as flat as possible, hammering everything down. I'm going to go in with the rasp again, making sure that it's roughed up in order to actually adhere the next layer. You can see this underlayer got a little bit damp because it was up against the lining, and the leaf portion is just sloughing off. So clearly a sign that if it's damp, it is not going to be able to take a lot of abrasion. But that does mean that I have a really good adherence. So very carefully working the top layer over the outside edges, curving it and folding it as I need to. Just as long as it's not showing over the edge, we'll be okay. At the very tip of the toe, I'm pleating it and folding it over kind of like a pair of Toms. That seemed to be the best way to deal with that complex area of shape and have it look uniform and even and intentional, rather than trying to hide a bunch of tiny little wrinkles. That last little bit of the toe gets folded over, adhered down, and then roughed up. And then we can finally get back to the cork piece. This is absolutely essential. The bottom of this shoe is really uneven and really bumpy right now, and there's a hollow in the middle where I don't have seam allowance. That needs to be filled, otherwise the sole is going to be really bumpy once I finally get it adhered down. So this thin layer of cork is what finishes that off and smooths it down, because it is a lot more flexible and it's also very easily removed. So I am just cementing it down, hammering it into place, and then I will start working around all of the edges to taper them down. Again, this is a little bit smaller than the sole leather, so even if I don't remove much, it won't be visible. And then I'm going back in with a flat side of a rasp in order to work everything down to a very smooth shape. So that way there's no lumps and bumps that will show through the sole leather. It has something that it likes to adhere to. The cement does really well with the cork, so I know that the sole isn't going to start pulling away in different places. We can then put the cement on that, which actually did about half an hour or so before I got to this point, just because it takes a while to dry on wet leather. And I need the sole leather still pretty damp. It's been soaking overnight. I did dry it off, and obviously it's been sitting for half an hour, but it needs to be malleable. It needs to get over those curves and be shaped. That's what I'm doing first off with the hammer, which will help hold it into the right shape. But for the first few minutes, it can sometimes be temperamental and pull away from the edges. A little bit of a fabric tape can go a long way in wrapping around, even just for a few minutes until the adherence between the layers really takes hold. So I do that, wait a little bit, come back, and I can finally pull out the last, which the instep leather comes out first, and that gives me plenty of freedom in order to pull out the last. Now, I do prefer to wait as long as possible to let the shoe dry, possibly even till the next day, and actually have a finished shoe. I do need to put a few holes in the back section as well, because I'll be lacing this across the foot, starting off with a really sharp awl and then moving in with a larger one to open up the hole just enough. No eyelets for this, just because I don't like the look of metal eyelets on this more earthier style. I'd rather just have a large enough hole to lace through.